everyone. Here we are. This is the last episode of Hot SciComm Summer. Every week this summer, I've shared a conversation with a talented science communicator to get their insights on how we can become more effective at translating insights from social science and science more generally beyond academic institutions. It's been super rewarding for me, and I hope you've been able to learn a lot as well. The seed of the idea for this series came to me on a walk in a forest preserve near my house a couple years ago. And now here we are, 13 interviews with incredible people with a variety of experience. To cap off this series, I picked some of my favorite ideas to come out of these conversations, one per episode, and I made a YouTube video counting them down. You can check out the notes for this episode for a link to that video. It'll be released just as soon as this episode drops. But I'm getting ahead of myself because the series isn't over yet. We still have one more fantastic person to talk to. I'm a social psychologist, so naturally, a lot of the people that I thought to invite for this show are people with close ties to psychology. But I really wanted to capture the idea of social science communication in general. And so to get a range of perspectives in the social sciences, I'm excited to share my conversation with political scientist John Sides. He's a professor at Vanderbilt University, but in 2007, along with David Park and Lee Siegelman, he helped found The Monkey Cage, a blog about political science and politics. It was named Blog of the Year in 2010, and in 2012, Time named it one of the best blogs that year. These days, The Monkey Cage is published at the Washington Post's website, and John currently serves as the publisher. As they put it, The Monkey Cage's mission is to connect political scientists and the political conversation by creating a compelling forum, developing publicly focused scholars, and building an informed audience. It really is an incredible achievement of connecting social scientists with the public in this format that really has been going strong for so many years. And in our conversation, John gives some backstory on The Monkey Cage, highlights what kinds of articles are successful there, and gives some really great insight on why and how to engage the public in political science research. I think you'll enjoy this one as a cap to this summer's collection of conversations. So let's jump right in. You know, it sort of is wild to me how long the Monkey Cage has been around. When I look at sort of when it started, it seemed like it was in a real heyday of blogs. Like I remember myself at that time being like a real blog junkie. And so it was kind of like you struck this at exactly the right moment when blogs were getting plenty of attention. And so I'm curious, like what was going on in 2007 that made you and others think that this was a thing to do?
At that point, I think there had been a handful of academic blogs or bloggers who had gotten a degree of prominence. This was particularly true in economics. Paul Krugman had a blog. Marginal Revolution was another, I think, pioneer in this space. But although there were some individual political scientists blogging in different forums, often their own sites, there just wasn't a political science blog that we thought really brought the research to bear on questions of daily interest. And in particular, that oftentimes meant that we felt like political reporting or political commentary was wrong or misinformed or uninformed. And, through no fault of their own, in a sense, right? Like, why would this research have ever crossed their path? Some of it's paywalled. So we felt like there was just an opportunity for us to provide some analysis, share research, respond to the news, respond to the kinds of pieces that other people were writing. And you're very much correct that this period of time when there were lots of individual blogs and bloggers really meant that there was a robust conversation that we could enter into. And at that point in time, people like Andrew Sullivan or Ezra Klein were the kinds of folks that we ended up being able to engage with and discuss our ideas, on our respective platforms and occasionally debate or what have you. So that was, I think, that was the motivation for doing it. And that really hasn't changed. We've been around now almost 15 years. And it really still is political science-based analysis of political issues and the news.
Were you a consumer of blogs? Like, it's a fairly specific idea to have, to say, let's do this. let's chart these uncharted waters.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was definitely reading different blogs, different social science disciplines. Marginal Revolution was one example, and there were some others. So you got a sense of, like, from reading them, you got a sense of the importance of, developing your own voice. You got a sense of the different kinds of ways you could construct a blog post, from a very brief, like, here's the abstract of an article that looks interesting, to something that's a more elaborated statement of your own views or opinions. People that would write with little bits of analysis and graphs and stuff like that, which is something we started doing early on. And I think that the great thing was that the three of us that started it, David Park and Lee Siegelman and I, especially over time, Lee and I, we both had kind of a, I don't know, just the right energy to do it. Just to be able to get up in the morning and say, what do I want to throw up on the monkey cage today? And over time, we've grown, first to a sort of a larger group blog. And now we're really much more of I don't know, like, we are really a disciplinary publication, right? We have a staff, we have, a couple of professional editors who are not political scientists. And, we are receiving and soliciting pieces from all corners of the discipline, domestic and international news. So, it's still a blog in the sense that if you go to the Monkey Cage homepage, it's the most recent post at the top. But it is different in the sense that it's probably less informal, and each piece really is a standalone, often 800 to 1,000 word analysis of whatever, something in Ukraine or whatever's happening. But so that's definitely changed the sort of the personality of the site. But at the same time, the upside of doing it that way is that you just vastly expand the amount of expertise that you're able to bring to bear. I don't know anything about Ukraine. I study American politics, but we have lots of folks who do know things about Ukraine or know things about lots of other places, regions, issues. So that gives us the ability, I think, to be consistently on the news cycle, and frankly, just to publish a lot more than we could publish if we were just relying on a few people, to wake up in the morning and think of something to say.
Well, it seems like you were publishing frequently in the early days, but it was a lot more informal and with different kinds of things. I was reading something on the kind of origins, and someone mentioned sort of you'd post like 3 times a day on this site, which seems crazy to me. That's a lot.
Well, I think there were definitely, periods of time when we were more or less active. So I wouldn't, if we were 3 days every day and three pieces a day on the earliest days of the site, that was a pretty productive day, and they weren't always like that. But yeah, I mean, I think that at that point in time, the original group of us, there was just a lot to say. Like, there was a lot of things that we felt like deserved some more emphasis. And again, because of the conversation that you were describing among these different sites and these different blogs, like, there was a lot to just respond to. So even, you weren't even just coming up with some idea that day based on something you had read, based on some research you had read, you were reading what other people had said and then, contributing something to that. That's changed too, as you know. I mean, there are lots of interesting blogs, but it's not quite the same space, I think, that it used to be. So, I mean, some of that has moved to Substack and places like that, but I think there's just a little bit less of that same kind of conversation. but I still feel like there is still an audience for the kind of stuff that we write. It's not obviously the best trafficked, content on the internet or anything like that. But it reaches people that are interested. It reaches people who are oftentimes in positions where, because they're journalists or because they're policymakers, they need a kind of information that's a little bit more than just your typical news story. And they need something that's not just a pure opinion piece about why Joe Biden should do such and such. So, we're trying to kind of occupy a niche where we can provide, like, well-grounded perspectives and evidence, and use that to sort of explain what's happening rather than to simply offer opinion about the right policy or the right course of action.
If you're to imagine like the typical reader of these articles, like who do you imagine?
Yeah, so we think of our audience as a combination of people that are in some sense professionally obligated to have some interest, and then people who are basically just ordinary citizens who happen to be regular news consumers. So in the former group, that's where I'd put the journalists and policymakers in various places, various parts of government and non-governmental organizations and places like that. In the latter group, sometimes when we're communicating with authors about how to sort of envision this group, I'll use my own mom as an example, who has a graduate degree and follows the news. But although she does actually have a little bit of training in some relevant things like statistics, she is certainly not a political scientist or a social scientist. And so basically, you're writing to her, you're writing to someone who knows things about the news, but doesn't know much about political science. Another good model, actually, and this is one that works for a lot of our authors, is undergraduate students are oftentimes extremely bright, very interested. They have some baseline familiarity with things that are going on in the news. You don't have to say, if you say the Samuel Alito's leaked opinion, they know what that is. But then, where do you go from there? Like, what's the next level of understanding or insight that you might need to have? So that's kind of where I think what we're trying to do. We are never going to be breaking news, right? Like, that's not how we don't function that way. I think our metabolism is pretty fast, but it's not that fast. But I think we are able to come along, sometimes within 24 to 48 hours of that breaking news event and provide that analysis. And then for an issue like Ukraine, right, that extends over a period of weeks, now maybe months, we're able to kind of continually, I think, supply ideas that reflect the distinctive contribution of political or other social scientists. But again, that has to be pitched at a level that's comprehensible to that modal reader that I described. And so obviously, in terms of science communication, that means not assuming knowledge that's unreasonable for people to have, which includes specific knowledge about like regions or countries of the world that most people might not be familiar with, or issues in the United States that people may not be familiar with. But it also includes, of course, all the social science jargon and methodology that really has to be submerged in order to make a piece comprehensible to this kind of reader.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page with the undergrad as a benchmark. So when I have people on the typical episode of this podcast, I'll say sort of imagine you're talking to someone who's like a mid to upper level undergrad, and they're interested, but they don't necessarily have the language that we've developed over time. And so like, let's share these things. So, and what this really is raising is a bigger question about who the audience for science communication is, which is something that I've struggled with too, where you go like, I want to reach the world, but the world is an unrealistic aspiration, just because there's going to be, presumably, right? Because there's going to be some barrier to entry that has to do just strictly with like interest. Would I even open up the link to read something like this?
Yep. Yeah, no, that's right. And I think that there are the other constraints that we face is that, first of all, there's a lot of competition. Like there's a lot of competing information, especially in digital media of different kinds. And so there's no reason to suspect that like monkey cage content is going to be at the tip of the spear on any given day. Almost never going to be the case. So that's absolutely fine. Most people don't consume digital news to consume politics, period. Like, and the people that do consume political news, are obviously interested in content that's probably, more dramatic or buzzier than what we're typically providing. But I think that part of our experience over time is that even if your daily page view numbers aren't off the charts, right? If there are a handful of people who read that have some position of influence, then that might be the force multipliers that you need, right, for that research to be more effective and important. And so when we hear from authors from time to time about this, and it's not just that their piece led to like another interview, let's say with a different media outlet, but it's their piece leads to contact from, I can just give examples off the top of my head. Contact from USAID and an invitation to come to Washington to present to a group, embassy staff in Mali, got in touch about something. I think it's people like that are a small but important audience to reach, and also I think the downstream benefit for the writer, for the scholar, is now you've made contacts, right, with interested and engaged people who work on similar issues as you, but they do so outside of the academy. But now your network is a little stronger as a scholar because you've been able to make contact with them and maybe meet with them and talk to them, and maybe that conversation then continues on its own, outside of the confines of monkey cage. So those are the best case scenarios from our standpoint. Not every author is going to experience that, of course, but that's what we're, I think, ideally hoping for.
You mentioned page views. I'm just curious, do you know offhand, like currently, what the daily page view is on monkey cage?
It's going to wax and wane depending on what's happening that day. We are the other challenge, I think, about the digital space, which is it's not just that it's crowded, it's that increasingly things do live behind a paywall, right? Our content lives behind the Washington Post's paywall, and social media amplification, particularly like a Facebook type place, is not nearly what it was 5 or 6 years ago. 2016 was the high point. And then as the Facebook algorithms shifted and as news organizations began to prioritize subscribers more so than just like traffic that would enter the site from social or from search, that changes the way that like our content's going to be read and engaged with. So it's not as much of a mass medium, right, as it used to be when you thought you could get, every piece was going to get a few thousand clicks just because of Facebook or even more. Now it may be getting fewer clicks, but it's getting clicks from the audience that, the Washington Post cares about, right, which is people who might subscribe. New York Times obviously has the same goal. Not lots of newspapers can't achieve that, especially like local and regional newspapers, but national publications, Financial Times, Economist, Wall Street Journal, etc., Times Post, that's how they're constructing a business model. As print is continues to die off and digital becomes the primary way in which we consume news. So so I think of if a scholar writes a piece for us and it gets 5,000 clicks or 10,000 clicks, I mean, I think that is a good success story. It's not a barn burner in the grand scheme of like what, I don't know, your average like BuzzFeed, quiz gets, or no, just the top line news stories at the Washington Post.
Hmm.
But what should we compare that number to? Like, well, yeah, if you compare it to the most highly trafficked content on the internet, it's a niche thing. If you compare it to the number of downloads that the average scholarly article gets, or even citations that the average scholarly article gets, or to the average number of copies that an academic press book sells, it's a lot more. So, I think in that sense, I'm happy. Um, I'm almost. I mean, I I would say most of the time, almost anything we publish is going to be read more than the average academic publication. So, even stuff that might be like nichier than the usual stuff that we publish. So for that reason, I think that even in a climate where there's a lot of competition and in which the business models of news organizations mean that you're not going to get as much traffic as you might have gotten 5 years ago, the traffic that you do get, right, can still be valuable for you as an author and can still be valuable in terms of the readership that it's reaching.
I ask for a number, not to praise or disparage whatever the number was, but just because I think when we move into public engagement, I mean, I at least have no benchmark for like what the reach would be. Like, is it 100? Is it tens of thousands? And it's just sort of like, I think Monkey Cage is in a good position to be like a pretty accurate temperature check of like, what is the interest in the public to read stuff like this? And so it seems like it's reaching those people. So pulling back a little bit, like what are benefits? Like why should anyone take any time out of their day to write an article for publication like this?
Yeah, great question. I would say that obviously you're not doing it for very obvious, clear, tangible material rewards, right? So it's not going to pay you anything. I mean, even if you write for the op-ed page, it's barely going to pay you a couple $100. Like it's not worth it, right? Just to do it for money, and it's not going to get. We don't expect that this is a substitute for peer-reviewed academic publications, right? So it's not as if we think that Monkey Cage is an alternative way to get tenure or anything crazy like that. For me, the motivation is, most of us do the research that we do because we think it's like valuable and we want it to be influential, right? Like we want people to know about it and to agree with it, or at least to engage with it. And I think people even doing very garden variety normal science research, I've certainly done my fair share of that. This is not path breaking. It's not super splashy, but even that stuff, right, can contribute something to a conversation that we're having about the pandemic or whatever the issue might be. So I think people should do it for that reason. They should do it just to try to maximize the impact of their ideas, and that's not just maximizing in the sense of communicating to people outside of the academy. I mean, to some extent, some of what the blogs that the scholarly community have generated over time, you're still talking to your peers here. There's a lot of research out there. Not everybody reads everything. We're all using different, I think, heuristics to try to keep track of the research that we should keep track of, which is based on like choosing certain journals to follow, using Twitter as a way of aggregating information about scholarly research, but a blog like Monkey Cage serves that role too. So you're talking to people outside of the academy, but you're also talking to your peers, and I think that's another way that you can get your ideas more uptake.
Yeah, I love the idea that, to kind of go back to your point about how Monkey Cage is not breaking news, right? Because there's a version of science communication that's like, this study just came out and it shows X, Y, and Z. And there are certain studies that lend themselves to that, right? Like some studies make good stories, or some result is like so incredible that it's inherently interesting. But what it seems like you all are doing, and to your point about leveraging even studies that are not splashy on their own, is that it's providing scholarly context for what's going on, right? Like
Yeah.
ultimately, it seems like that's the spirit of what you all are doing.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely get pieces and pitches that are very much in the vein of this article just came out. And sometimes those work, but I think there's sort of two limitations just off the bat. One is that the article may or may not have a good news hook. So we might need to wait months, like maybe longer, right, for the right hook, right, the thing that's really going to make readers say, "Oh, yeah, I should learn about this now." And secondly, I think the other question would be, how many pieces of research, are truly, I think, broad and important, major substantive contributions. A lot of them aren't, right? So the question is, at the end of the day, are we better off as a discipline just having like one piece about one article, or are we better off like with pieces that have the capacity to synthesize some of a broader literature, and point out what it contributes, but maybe what its limitations are? That's always, I think, to me, a safer way of communicating. The risk of the individual study, as you know, and you see it in psych all the time, you see it in nutrition all the time, right? Is the study that's like, blueberries add 5 years to your life. It's like, that's garbage, right? But, it's the kind of thing with, for science reporters who, sometimes are looking for low-hanging fruit, not to, no pun intended. That's the kind of thing you glom onto, and then you discover that A, it doesn't have solid research design because it's just self-reported measures of things you eat. B, and this is where what psych is experienced, doesn't replicate, right? Like this experiment isn't necessarily very reliable. So, I think in the end of the day, like I think that oftentimes where we provide the most value out of it is the ability to bring to bear more than just one study. And the other thing that we can bring to bear maybe this is a little bit perhaps unique to some parts of political science, is that we have people who, when they're writing about current events, they're not actually writing about any specific research. What they are is a scholar who knows that country and that region very well, much better than maybe even the reporters who are stationed there, because these are scholars who came from that region, live in that region, speak that language, can read the media of that country in that language. And so they're really able to provide, I think, a granular level of insight and context. And that's basically explaining the news, but it's not explaining the news through the lens of a particular peer-reviewed publication. It's just explaining the news by using the basic knowledge that you've accumulated over time. So if to some extent, when we do those things, I think we are avoiding the pitfalls of here's my new study type pieces, which may or may not be as effective.
So this all alludes to it, but if we think of people wanting to send in a pitch, what are the elements of that would stand out to you as worth running?
Yeah. So first of all, what is the news hook that I want? What is the thing I'm writing about? And then secondly, it's what am I bringing to bear on that subject? What is the research? What is the insight? What is the knowledge? Like, tell me what you're going to say here. That's important. That's, I think, the two main elements of it. And I think when that is most successful, first of all, the news hook is fresh. The news hook is in the news. It's not 2 weeks ago, which is an eternity. And then secondly, the research is really tightly connected to that news event. I think that, sometimes as scholars, we can be very creative and stretching, the research that we've done so that it, could say something about another domain. And I think that to the lay reader, that sometimes feels like a non sequitur. So I think I'm most interested in and persuaded by research where the connection is really tight, the connection's really clear. Readers are not going to go, wait a minute, that's apples and oranges. You wrote a study about the Ebola outbreak, but the Ebola outbreak is not the same as the coronavirus outbreak. So, you have to be very thoughtful about how you bridge, between research that is not exactly on the news topic to the topic that you're using as the news hook. And sometimes that's doable, right? Because there may be lessons from Ebola that we should understand in the context of COVID. But how you do that, people who do that well, it works. People who are sort of fishing a little bit to see if there might be a way they could talk about their article from 10 years ago, that may or may not work as well. It really just depends.
It strikes me that that's a subtle difference between political science and social psych, because I think there's a tendency in social psychology to say that what we're really uncovering are basic principles. And so, sure, I discovered this in one context 10 years ago, but ultimately, isn't this the same thing? You saw this in the early days of COVID, for sure. Lots of people I have something to say about this. Whereas political science often, to me, strikes me as a lot more within a structure of all the political and social parameters of this moment and these people and this event. And so it strikes me as not surprising that would be a harder claim to make from that perspective.
It really depends. I would say that having written a lot about American elections in the context of the blog, but also in some of my own research, there are days when I can reach back to a piece that was written 50 or 60 years ago, or to a body of literature that began 50 or 60 years ago, and be like, it's no different now. We've known this for a long time. And that's really kind of our version of, to give one example, the idea that people's partisanship, their identity as Democratic or Republican is a filter through which they perceive the world, right? So it affects how they understand and believe and process information. That's 1960s, some of the earliest stuff that basically said that it's a perceptual screen, So in some sense, that's not a new idea. And there are other things like that. But on the other hand, there are things that have changed in American elections and in American politics. Some things are sort of decades-long processes or trends. There are elements of what we sort of tend to call sort of polarization that fall in that category. And then there are stuff that's very recent, that's happened quite recently. One example of that is just the way in which Democratic and Republican voters increasingly differ on issues related to race, ethnicity, nationality, identity broadly construed. Right? Some of those differences are really differences that emerged most sharply in the Trump era. So again, if you're writing about, identity politics, as it's sometimes called, you have to be conscious that the landscape is different now than it was even in 2015. So again, what we can bring to bear on that might have some grounding in this longer term accumulated body of literature. It might have grounding in first principles. Certainly it has some relevance in terms of how social psychology thinks about these things. But obviously, that doesn't tell us what happened in 5 years. That's something that's much more distinctly political. And you have to think about how can I use research that is, really plugged into that, to this very recent trend, helps us understand it, and doesn't feel like an anachronism compared to what's happening.
Especially because it sounds like plenty of the readers are policymakers and legislators and people who would probably be quicker to see that this is a different world than when these data were from.
Well, and sometimes, and sometimes unfairly, right? Sometimes people think, oh, well, that was from that study's 3 years old. This is sometimes for undergrads. The undergrads have that mentality a little bit sometimes, where it's you gave me some old research. And I think that's sometimes that's not the right attitude. That research is still germane, right? And we should still be talking about it. But yeah, there are times, right, where I would be if you're going to show me a 2016 study about party differences on identity issues, I'd be like, well, that seems right at that moment, but 4 to 5 years later, there have been massive changes. The percentage of Democrats who want to increase immigration has gone up by double digits. Right? So what do we make of that? And so it would be really incumbent on the author in that context to help the reader understand, again, why that research, even though it was done sort of before some important things, how does that research help us understand what's going on today? It's not that you have to have a survey or a poll like literally came out last week. I mean, that's helpful, but so it's not like the data has to be, super fresh. But again, you're trying to make readers think that like this is relevant, this is useful, and so sometimes you have to find ways to really make it feel topical.
This question is maybe a little more abstract than is fair, but what are the kinds of things that political science can provide in terms of, analyzing current events? Like, in other words, I sort of imagine there's sort of like a taxonomy of like types of articles that you run. And like, what are those kinds of like models?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so some of it is, there's sometimes we publish pieces that are like, here's some knowledge that like is really valuable, but is basically like no one has. It's like secret knowledge. Because someone has studied a topic that's suddenly in the news and they know a lot about it. And it's just like they're really, I mean, almost like the wizard, it's like been like, or I don't know, like you rubbed the lamp and the genie popped up, and then that's the person that's there to tell you what's going on. I think that's one model. Another model, which is always fun to write, is this person is wrong. Like, for example, like, Samuel Alito's leaked opinion made some passing reference to the fact that like if, he wants to put these abortion law right back in the legislature, and he points out that, well, of course, women have political power, they turn out more than men. And we published a piece that was like, well, wait a minute, like that may be true, but that's not how we should think about the political power of women. That's wrong. Like that's vastly incomplete to the point of being highly misleading, right? That's their argument, right? So that's fun. You can pick a fight. Someone on the internet is wrong, right? Is the old phrase we use to describe that kind of piece. I also find that there is real value in someone who understands like an ongoing issue, but in a way that no one is also likely to understand it. So the best example I can come up with is congressional procedure, right? So this is not some new thing that pops in the news where someone had some secret knowledge. This is like every, few weeks, we have to have a go round about like, why is the Senate not doing something? Or what is going on? And it's understanding not just that the Senate has to get to 60 votes on lots of different things, but it's more generally like trying to sort of unpack the parliamentary maneuvering that's gone on with regard to this particular type of debate. So I used to joke that one of our editors and frequent contributors, who's a political scientist at GW named Sarah Bender, I used to call Sarah the Senate whisperer, right? Like the horse whisperer, because she's the one person who can like look at 2 days worth of like Senate procedural wrangling and just tell you what happened. And so, and if you don't know Senate rulemaking and rules, which are, again, arcane, you're not going to be able to, I think, make as much sense of that. It'll just strike you as weird and like, what? Why do people do it that way? I don't know. Sarah will tell you, like, this is why it's this way, and this is what happened. So I think of those are three different kinds of examples. The secret knowledge piece, the someone's wrong on the internet piece, and just the I don't know what you want to call that, the Senate example, but just the ability to take something unfamiliar and make it comprehensible. I think that is another thing that we that we really like.
The someone on the internet is wrong reminded me, you've written before about not only the benefits of public engagement, but also the drawbacks or the potential challenges that you might face. Like,
Yeah.
Are there reasons why you would say this isn't for everyone, or you don't have to do this? Here are reasons why you might not do this. Like, what are the drawbacks of public engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I think the drawbacks, probably the main drawback is just, you end up in a fight, or you end up getting reactions to the piece that you wrote, which are bad faith responses, which are hostile. And at times, of course, that hostility can be tinged with, racism and misogyny, or more than tinged. And this is why, of course, as a lot of people have written, the experiences of women and people of color who do public writing of different kinds oftentimes can be a much more difficult experience for them. So, not everyone has an appetite for that. It's at a minimum distracting sometimes, like to know that, like, in your Twitter mentions, this nonsense is going on. At worst, it's really distressing. And so I don't think that is by any sense the modal experience of one of our contributors, mainly because, again, we're fairly niche. And if people want to get mad at somebody who writes on the internet, like, there's a lot of people who are much more prominent than political scientists, needless to say, who deal with a lot. So I would say that's a downside. I would also, I think that, the idea that academics communicate to broader audiences in platforms like blogs has become more widely accepted, but I know there are pockets of people who view it as a distraction from what you're supposed to be doing, who think of it as like you're going slumming, to do pop politics, pop psych. You're not really doing serious research when you're writing for an outlet like Monkey Cage. So I always encourage, people, especially junior scholars and graduate students, to sort of be conscious of sort of take the temperature of the people who have power over your life and make sure that this is something they're on board with. When we started the Monkey Cage, like, I was an assistant professor, but my co-blogger Lee Siegelman was my senior colleague. So I felt like, okay, if Lee's doing this with me, I'm not in trouble, right? Like, I'm not going to have to called into, like, well, John, we've seen you've written a lot of blog posts. So no one saw it as some zero-sum game, where every minute I spent writing something for the Monkey Cage was a minute I should have been spending doing something else. But I definitely would encourage people to make sure that this is something that's appreciated. Oftentimes, colleges and deans appreciate it because they like that their professors are out there writing, and and of course, for people who write for us, it's in the Washington Post, so that's pretty nice. But sometimes I think, particularly at a departmental level, that can be, depending on your colleagues, sometimes that can be a bit of a stumbling block for them, and it shouldn't be. I mean, I'd like that to continue to change, but I'm not going to deny that it exists. So those are, I think, the main potential risks that you might face. Hopefully, though, those are not things that are common, or especially the online sort of hostility. I would like I'd like that not to be common, or when it happens, to be in bounds in terms of sort of scholarly norms or discourse, or just public discourse norms, so that we're not, it's not name calling and the like. It's a genuine attempt to sort of debate, or the merits of the argument.
On the rosier side, but similarly confronting kind of old norms. I really loved in writing about the benefits of blogging as a social scientist. You talk about what you call appreciative thinking as something that inspires, which is something I've totally experienced doing the podcast, where, similar to your experience, you go, I might open up a journal and go, this looks trash. I don't want to read this. This is probably wrong. But now instead I go, oh, maybe people would be interested in this, or maybe this has something to contribute. And it changes your thinking on other people's work, right? Like, it inspires this kind of more collaborative, collegial opportunity. So I'm curious on two fronts, right? On Monkey Cage, does it seem like a lot of the time people are talking about their own work and how it relates to the news, or that it's really a platform that people can sort of expansively cover work in an area? And do you, I mean, this is probably 10 years ago that you wrote this. Do you stand by the appreciative thinking benefits of public engagement?
Yeah. So when I wrote about that, I was thinking a lot about the way that we train academics and the fact that we're trained to be critical. And there's benefits to that, of course, because we want to identify, the shortcomings of the literature, or we want to identify things that maybe even are wrong, and we want to do better. And so when we're, you go to your first year PhD seminars and, you get a bunch of reading to do, I think oftentimes the instinct that you have, or the instinct that is cultivated, is one of dismissing it, or, being, wow, it was just one sample, or, that kind of stuff. Not wrong necessarily, but again,
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes in my own, teaching, I try to encourage people to do some of the opposite, right? Like, what are the good things? Like, what have we contributed what have they contributed by writing this piece? What have we learned from writing it? So part of what I think oftentimes is the reason why that connects to writing for a place like the Monkey Cage is that a lot of that writing is appreciative, right? It's not just appreciative of your own work, which of course naturally people would be, but it's also, I think, the ability, for scholars to, if they're synthesizing, a body of research, like you were saying, then, they really are making a really concrete statement about what we've learned, and that it's important and it's relevant in these ways. And you may be writing that even for a somewhat skeptical audience who doesn't think that there's a lot we should learn from political science, or how can politics, how can that be a science? Like, we've all heard these rejoinders a million times. So I think of that as I think it's just a good exercise. It's a good exercise for people to engage in, no matter if they're an academic or not, like, just to be appreciative of other people's perspectives and viewpoints. But rather than just to be sort of, either defensive or on offense all the time. But I think that's one of the for me, like, one of the things that has been encouraging about Monkey Cage over the years is just to be pleasantly surprised by how much interesting research is going on, and how much my colleagues in the discipline, many of whom I don't know at all, know personally at all, like how much the vast range of things that people can write about and contribute to. I remember at one point I had a friend who's a political scientist now at Northeastern. Daniel Aldrich is his name. And I've known over the years, I've known him since undergrad, that he was doing research on how decisions are made about where to situate facilities of different kinds that are perceived to be dangerous or risky. And so, like, where would you put them? And of course, there's all kinds of local politics around, like, where do you put these kinds of places? And one of his case studies is sort of nuclear plants or nuclear facilities. And in particular, one of his case studies is Japan. And then Fukushima happens. And I mean, what a terrible, terrible tragedy. But Daniel Aldrich he had literally written a book about where nuclear facilities are sited in Japan. And among other things. But and I was just like, that is, that to me was one of those moments where you are just so deeply appreciative that someone put in this work for years, field work in Japan, field work in France, did all this stuff. And then, in the moment where this terrible thing has happened and where a tsunami has engulfed, a nuclear power facility, Daniel's there to be able to say something about it. And that's a really, I think, very unique example in certain ways, that very specific marriage of knowledge to current event. But I think that that's true in other ways as well. So yeah, I'm not always so optimistic or positive. I can read scholarly journals and I can pick at individual pieces, or I can also get on my high horse and be like, well, there's too much of this kind of research in the discipline, but not enough of this kind of research. We can all do that. And maybe those critiques are correct, but I still think at the end of the day that, I still find it valuable doing monkey cage work to get to appreciate the vast amount of interesting and diverse research that's going on.
And sort of, it's a nice feeling to know, like, oh, I'm part of this discipline that generally can allow us to understand stuff like this better, right? Like, I'm doing my part, but like, I'm part of a collective that's enabling us to understand the world better.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's a lot of people we've had. I haven't looked at the number in the it's been several months since I've looked at the numbers, but we've had, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000, maybe more now, individual people author or co-author pieces for us. So yeah, it's absolutely that. It's a vast collaborative. And we can always do more to enlarge the group of people that are writing for us, to find people that haven't been well represented on our site. And that's something we continue to do. So I don't think that number by itself, is a signal that our work is finished or done. But it is a signal that every month, every year, there are a lot of new faces who come and write for us for the first time. Many of them then write again at some point in the future too. So it's not just a one-off thing. It's something that they have, a little bit stronger commitment to. And I think that's the way it should be. This is to your point earlier about how we think about talking about individual research projects versus talking about like more synthetical accounts of literatures. I think one of the things that sometimes happens in academia is you get sort of hype about individual studies that exceeds what the study itself can actually tell us, but you also get hype about individual scholars because news media needs to frame reporting around interesting people. And so sometimes, much as they frame news stories about politics around the president or other kinds of political figures, they frame news stories in academia about, academic personalities. And, I don't think that those kinds of stories are wrong exactly. I don't begrudge attention to people who are influential scholars who have written, interesting work. But I think the downside risk, which you see in a lot of these kinds of stories, is that there's not much effort to sort of situate what that scholar has accomplished within the broader literature, or to bring to bear the debates about that scholar's work. Instead, it's more like, you've seen these news stories. It starts in the messy faculty office, and it comments, on what the professor's sort of personality, and then it sort of follows the story of how the research developed, and and this becomes kind of heroic in the context of those stories, and all the more if there's a field medal or there's a Nobel Prize that you can, that they've won or that you can slap on them. So, I think that hopefully part of the way that we're able to contribute to scholarly communication is not by valorizing a small number of influential scholars or faculty, right? But by, again, trying to provide a very wide-ranging platform for scholars that are at different kinds of places, from top research universities, to other kinds of institutions, and sort of show like that these folks have things to contribute that are important. And moreover, that oftentimes these folks are the ones who actually write the best in this format. That's one of the things that I've also gained some appreciation for, and it often surprises me, is like, who's good at this? Who's good at 800 words, tight, concise, no jargon, and who sends me 1,500 words with 17 footnotes, And then, that's fine. That's fair. Like, that just means you need to do some work on just sort of helping people learn how our format works. But like, there's clearly people who have a knack right out of the gate, and other folks that don't. And those things don't necessarily align with the traditional markers of academic prestige.
To that point, my last question for you was just sort of, you've written a lot, You've seen a lot of this stuff written. You've seen examples of good writing and not as good writing. And so even just generally, for social scientists who want to communicate their science outside of academia, do you have any sort of more practical advice for like, how do I convey these ideas in a way that your mom could understand?
Yeah. I've like, I think a handful of just initial ideas like right out of the gate. One is that no one cares about the theory or the literature that you are debating or engaged with. So sometimes scholars really want to tell you that there are these other three contending theories, and that those theories are wrong, and my theory is right. And the average reader has no idea what these theories are, or doesn't care a lick about what scholars are arguing about, with each other. They're interested in Ukraine, or they're interested in like Supreme Court politics and abortion, or whatever the case may be. So you take that stuff out of you just stop. You don't do that at all. The second piece of advice is state your argument in a tweet. Like just pretend. Like actually, I kind of like to do, and I also do it in Twitter 1.0. Do it in 120 characters, not 240. Because that's going to have to go at the end of the first paragraph when you've sort of put the news hook and you've like brought the reader in and made them think this will be interesting to read because it's about this thing that I heard about. But you have to be able to state that argument in a way, and the argument can't be something woolly like, I will show that there are important conditions under which the thing, like one of these kind of scholarly arguments that's got like 6 clauses and sort of tangled. Like, what's the argument? Subject, verb, word, period. Like that's the argument. And then I would say that the other thing that we encourage scholars to do, especially when they're talking about their own research, is to show the reader what you did. Tell the reader what you did. I mean, just do an example that would be relevant to the social psych. We did an experiment in which some respondents read a news story that mentioned XYZ, but other people read a news story that represented ABC, and then other people didn't read any news story. And then we asked them some questions. And what we found was that 25% of people who read the first story said this, but only 10% of people who read the second story said that. All right, be transparent about your research. Like sometimes people hide that. Like it's funny, like but you have to describe it in accessible ways, but you got to be able to show readers like, this is why you should pay attention to me. I'm not just a guy with opinions, or a person with opinions. I'm someone who's done something. And I also would say that another thing that's valuable, and this is like the last point, because now we've actually kind of moved sequentially through the piece. I think it's always helpful to have what we sometimes refer to as the "to be sure" paragraph. To be sure, comma, and then this is your opportunity to say what might be some caveats or limitations of what you've done, or it might just be an opportunity for you to say, to be sure, there are some other things that we don't know, right? Like we might be the literature now, not we, the scholars who've done a specific piece of research. So I think being able to write that paragraph sometimes is helpful. Head those critiques off at the pass. Head correlation is not causation off at the pass. Head like whatever it is, off at the pass, and be modest about what your contribution is. And that way we don't end up with the blueberries make you live longer kind of framing. So I think those would be some of the initial pieces of advice. And then, the other stuff I would say really now it gets down into the nitty gritty of like how sentences are constructed and stuff like that. And I think, the easiest way to think about that is just to think about sentences being short and vigorous. So don't write you have to put yourself in a different mindset than a scholarly article. But that is not something that happens. We all can't flip a switch and do that. So to some extent, that's what emerges in the process of editing that we do with individual pieces and authors, is to sort of show them like what this might look like if you took some of their sentences and rewrote them, be different. more active voice, less passive voice, whatever it is that that particular piece needs. But there's no general principle there that's easy to convey.
It's just do it, try
Well,
it.
yeah. Well, just learn it, and it just again, it takes time. Like there's no like reason that people should know how to do it. No one's ever trained to do this. Some people who are the best at it usually were like, oh, I was the editor of the high school newspaper. Like, yes, then you can write because you've learned how to do like what journalists do. But then other folks, like, you've gone to undergrad, you've gone to graduate school, you took a bunch of methods courses, you took a bunch of, substantive courses in your area. You wrote a lot of papers, but you wrote papers primarily, to conform to scholarly models and norms. And there's no reason that you should have had any experience writing for a different kind of audience. So, we try to give people sort of some baseline sort of ideas about how you structure a piece, like what comes first, what comes second. Don't forget to describe your research in these very transparent but accessible ways. Don't overclaim, add caveats, et cetera. But then, when we get down to the specifics of how a piece works, it's really about clarifying things that where, despite our best intentions, we're still making assumptions about what the reader knows. I did this once in a piece. I think I edited it and then sent it to our professional editor. And she wrote back to me and said, what does first past the post mean? That's a way of describing electoral systems, right? Where the person with the most votes wins, as opposed to like proportional systems and stuff like that. And I was like, all right, yeah, first past the post. It's a horse race. It's a horse from horse racing, right? It's a metaphor. But she was like, how is that? And I'm like, all right, yeah. So you're still going to have those kinds of moments, or you're people who write us pieces about elections in different countries where they have multi-party systems. And then from right out the gate, they're like, okay, so the SPD won the plurality of seats, followed by the SPA and the PAS. And you're like, who are those parties? Like, I don't know what the acronyms mean. Who's the social democrat? Who's the not? Who's the left? Who's the right? Like, so some of that you have to, we'll come back and help you explain that. But and then the other stuff will just be more about like just improving the quality of writing to the extent that we can. And again, that's not because we're trying to be persnickety or trying to be difficult. I mean, hopefully, it's really because we're just trying to maximize the impact of the piece to get back to the fundamental mission of why people should be writing this in the first place. And you guys, and and we all know from consuming information on the internet that especially on our phones, how many thumb flicks are we going to give a piece before we quit? Part of the reason why it has to be 800 words or 1,000 words is to get people to the end of it. But they're certainly not going to get to the end of it if by the second paragraph they're confused or they find it difficult to read. And so we're trying to get people to the end, trying to make it so that the people that are interested in this topic really will read and understand like what you're able to tell them and what you're able to contribute as a scholar.
Your story also seems to speak to one of the benefits of moving to the Post, which was you had a journalistic editor who could swoop in and play the role of, I'm not a political scientist, I don't know what this means, which is hard to do, right? You can't just magically unlearn something in order to write it. Would you say that has been an asset, right? To have someone
we as a site, we hired our own professional editors. We had a bunch of grant money from different foundations that helps to basically pay salaries for two people who read and edit almost everything that goes on the site. And then there is a layer of review at the Post that is capable of catching anything else that's sitting there that's not right or needs a little bit further explanation. So, we're fortunate that we can do a lot of that work internally, like before the piece gets like sent into the Post's system and reaches their editors. But that's exactly why we did it. Otherwise, we the individual political scientists on the site have done our fair share of that over time as well. But I think it's valuable to have that the non-specialist's perspective, And also to marry that perspective with like the skill set that an editor has in terms of asking questions and improving writing. So that is an experience I think that most scholars just don't get. And the reason, I assume this is true in psych as well as in political science. Like, and a journal editor is not an editor in the sense of improving prose. Journals don't hire people who do that work. Even academic presses, they do have editors. I mean, they have editors who commission and review manuscripts. There is a copy editing process, but a copy editor is not someone who says, "Boy, that sentence could be, half as long," right? The copy editor just says, fixes the, errors and gets things, in the style of the press in terms of which words they capitalize and which words they don't, or do they hyphenate and that kind of stuff. So, it can be a rude awakening, I think, sometimes as scholars to have real editing happen. This happened to me very early on in a piece I wrote for the Boston Review, which actually was edited by an academic. And I remember when he sent the piece back to me and my co-author, and I was like, "Oh, you want it to sound like that?" Oh, like I had no idea. Like, and once I saw what he wanted it to sound like, I got it. Like, I understood why he was making the edits that he was making. And it totally changed the vernacular of the piece. So I think that, as scholars, it's never fun to be told that you need to change things. We get very committed to our ideas and to our specific word choices. But again, the value of that kind of editing is it makes you a clearer communicator. And there is, I think, evidence that kind of clear communication not only improves a piece that's targeted at a broader audience, but it might improve your scholarly writing and improve the ability of your scholarly writing to be influential within the scholarly community, because we're, as scholars, no different from ordinary readers in this respect. Writing that we find difficult to understand is harder for us to in some sense, like, incorporate into our own ideas about the world and then cite that research. So again, I'd like to think that there are real downstream benefits to this kind of editing process for academics, even though you're going to have to look at a lot of red ink in the short run.
You sort of pinpointed the sort of dirty side secret of what this series is supposed to be doing, which is, my hope is that even if people don't actually do a ton of like public writing, these are communication skills. Like, there's no reason, it's crazy that we get so little training in writing and giving talks and communicating.
Yeah, I know.
And all the stuff that's going to make you resonate with a general audience is stuff that's going to improve your communication within the field. So I think you're right on target there.
Yeah, and it's really true. I find myself, having done a bunch of blogging and then having written these election books, which were targeted at a broader audience. I really, when I sit down and write an article that I am planning to send to a scholarly journal, I really find myself, I find that my sentences are shorter. I find that I'm really conscious of the flow from sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph. All the things like that come into play in writing for, a newspaper, let's say, are there in my mind. Then, you get to the methods section and, hey, look, you got to say what you did, and you got to use the same boilerplate language that we all use. And you got to have little parenthetical references to, this is true in psych, especially all the statistical stuff, But even in that context, I still think that there's ways in which the blog style of writing or the public style of writing could be helpful to refine the way you communicate even to a scholarly audience.
Well, this has been super helpful. So I just wanted to say thanks for taking the time to talk about all this.
Thank you, Andy. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much to John Sides for breaking down the monkey cage. You can go to this episode's page on opinionsciencepodcast.com to find links to John's website as well as the monkey cage itself. And you know what? Let me take this opportunity to thank everyone who graciously gave me their time so that we could all learn a little more about why and how to be effective communicators of science. So, big thank you to Joss Fong, Meryl Horn, David McCraney, David Nussbaum, Taylor Scott, Evelyn Carter, Daniel Pink, Vanessa Bonds, Jesse Thorne, Kurt Nelson, Tim Houlihan, Ali Caldwell, Micah Caldwell, Steve Rathjay, and of course, John Sides. Really a privilege to be able to meet them all. Alrighty, I'll say it one last time. This series on science communication is a special presentation of my podcast, Opinion Science, a show about the science of our opinions, where they come from, and how they change. You can subscribe any old place where they have podcasts, your Apples, your Googles, your Spotifys, and you can help spread the word about the podcast and this science communication series in particular by sharing it on social media, passing it along to scientists, science writers, journalists, friendly people you meet on the street, and leaving kind reviews of the podcast online. Okie dokie. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm excited to pick Opinion Science back up where we left it last May. I've already recorded some great conversations with folks who study opinions and persuasion, so good things are coming on that end. I will probably take a quick break before the podcast machine starts churning again. This weekly summer series has been a lot, and with the fall semester, being here already, I might need a couple weeks for adjustment, but it won't be too long before we're back together. So get some rest, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.